So good morning, everyone. Herm Shalansky here, Chair of the Jewish Community Relations Council of the United Jewish Federation of Tidewater, and I am so happy to welcome more than 200 community members from Tidewater and around the Commonwealth for this special conversation with Senator Mark Warner. In just a minute, you'll be hearing from the Senator, followed by some time for questions and answers. Please submit those at the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we're going to do the best we can to get to as many of them during our 45 minutes together. Senator, we're grateful for your leadership in these past 12 years in the Senate, your service on the Finance, Banking, Budget, Rules Committee, as well as your position as Vice Chair of the Select Committee on Intelligence, and of course, prior to that as our Governor. We appreciate your service and to our Commonwealth and our country and your commitment to all Virginians, as well as your willingness to share your time with us this morning. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Tidewater and turn the call over to you to share some of your views from Washington on the recent establishment of diplomatic relationships between Israel, the UAE, and Bahrain. Senator, over to you.
Well, Herm, thank you. And first of all, to everyone in the community, Happy New Year. I know Rosh Hashanah was on Friday night, and while I've over the years celebrated with friends, Rosh Hashanah this year was marred a little bit, obviously, by the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I know maybe some of the conversation will move to the Supreme Court, but just make a comment about her. She was a remarkable, remarkable woman. I had the opportunity to actually went to law school with her daughter and had a chance to meet her a number of times. And I think no matter kind of what our political views would be, she was someone who always strove for justice. And as a father of three daughters who are 25, 29, and 30, they live in a fairer and juster America because of Justice Ginsburg. Again, Herm, I'd really appreciate the community being willing to let me give this report. I mentioned this to my good friend Art Sandler the other day, and I know this has come together fairly quickly, and appreciate the chance to give you an update. What I thought I'd do is start my comments in terms of the historic activities that took place last week and talk through some of the challenges that we face going forward. I start as somebody who has taken great pride in my time both as governor and as senator in trying to strengthen and support the U.S.-Israel relationship. I remember when I was governor, we started the U.S. Virginia-Israel partnership. I've had the opportunity to go to Israel a number of times. I've done business in Israel. I've taken my family on holiday to Israel. And it's obviously a remarkable country with that is the true home of the Jewish people. I think last week we saw a significant move forward. I am not traditionally a fan of the Trump administration on many items, but I want to give them credit where credit is due in terms of establishing relationships or helping to broker relationships between Israel, UAE, and Bahrain. I think this has been conversations that have been going on for some time. The UAE ambassador Yusuf Atebe has been a longtime friend, and I know he has been thinking about this, advocating this for years. But the fact that it came to pass, I give him credit. I give President Trump credit. I give Prime Minister Netanyahu credit. And my hope is that this can be an opening that can expand to other Arab countries in the region, which would be a great move towards peace. I also think it was very important and appropriate that Prime Minister Netanyahu, suspended all efforts to do annexation, which I think would have actually thrown back the progress of peace a great deal. So I think things are at a good state right now. I know there's some conversations about whether Sudan may be next, and I think that we have a number of us have been urging for some time that Sudan come off the terrorist designation list. And while I'm not privy to the particular negotiations. It would not surprise me if Sudan, also established relationships. Beyond that, I know there's some talk of Saudi. I don't think Saudi will anything happen in the short term. I think the most important next step in terms of kind of regional relations is to see if a brokerage of relations can be reestablished between UAE and Qatar. The Qataris are, I probably know more details on the Qatari UAE dispute than I would care to know. It feels a lot like a internal family feud, but the Qataris having enormous gas resources. If the Gulf Council is split as it is, and it has been, and this has split families, my fear is that this will push the Qataris, who are fairly wily, into potential closer relationships with Iran. And my goal is, and I think America's goal should be, to continue to try to isolate Iran. A couple of other comments, and then we'll open up for questions. I continue to be a strong supporter of the U.S.-Israel aid package, the $3.3 billion. I'm an early co-signer onto that support, that bilateral support, economic, military, is good for both countries. It's good for the United States. It's also good for Israel. Particularly, it's good for the United States in terms of technology transfer back and forth in terms of weapon development. That is something that's very important. On another issue, I've been very supportive over the years of fighting all of the BDS movements that take place. That was more a topic over the last couple of years. But again, I think I'm very happy that the Congress continued to act in such a bipartisan way on standing up against those who would advocate for BDS. I am concerned that I know the administration is trying to unilaterally snap back sanctions on Iran. And let me be clear, as the vice chair of the Intel Committee, the Iranians are bad actors. They have they clearly promote violence. They are threats to the United States. They are one of the countries that our intelligence community has indicated are trying to meddle in our elections. They obviously are an existential threat to Israel. So I stand united with Israel in trying to make sure that we limit the activities of Iran. It is challenging, though, and I'm not sure how this is going to fully play out. I'll be anxious if anybody on the call has specific views on this. When we pulled out of the JPO, I always get my initials, JPOC. No, it's JP, the joint agreement with Iran. The fact that the remaining countries kept the sanctions on, I think, ended up being of net value to us. I do worry when the other nation, when we've tried to impose a snapback sanctions at this point, whether other nations, particularly our European allies, will follow suit or not. I think this is a little bit of a challenge that I have with the Trump administration overall, is that even when they are directionally right, sometimes their execution of their policies are a little rocky in terms of, especially if they require bilateral activities. So I'm going to be very anxious to see how the Germans, the French, the Brits respond on snapback, and obviously we won't have the support of Russia or China. Last comment I wanted to make, and this I think is something I've been working on for some time, but it's not. It is not. It's not directly related, but I think the community might be interested, and that is, over the last 2.5 years, I've been building a bipartisan consensus about how we grapple with the rise of China. And let me be clear, when I speak of China, I'm not anti-Chinese, but I am very much anti-Communist Party of China, anti-Xi Jinping. We China has a plan to try to be leaders in all of the advanced technologies. Um, I'm an old telecom guy, as some of you know. They, with their company Huawei, are taking a very, very aggressive role in 5G. They are actually at the level of trying to set technology standards for 5G, facial recognition, artificial intelligence, quantum computing. This is, I think, a huge danger to the United States, the single greatest economic and potentially national security threat we face. Because China allows ferocious competition in their domestic market, then they have a single company arise like Huawei, and then that company gets enormous backing around the world. This is reflected in unfortunately, the United States and the West declining influence even on standard setting. And when I say standard setting, I mean the rules, the protocols, the procedures in advanced technology. And it's really hard to take on a Chinese national champion if they have 75% of the Chinese market, and then, as in the case of Huawei, are backed $100 billion by the Chinese government. It's a long way around of saying one of the things that I've been exploring, one is building bipartisan consensus that the United States needs to step up, and John Cornyn and I, Republican senator from Texas, have stepped up on a major initiative to support the American semiconductor industry. But we're also talking about an alliance of the willing around the world. And this, I think, is a wonderful opportunity to take our original Five Eye partners, add some of our European friends, add South Korea, Japan, India, and Israel as a framework of a technology alliance with shared technology resources. Israel clearly is a leader, and it's an area that I'm in the midst of trying to get rehired. But if I do get rehired, I hope to take a continuing role. How we think about a multilateral strategy, including Israel, to grapple with the rise of China. Final comment, and that is just that I've also spent an enormous amount of time in the last couple of years, as many know, as the vice chair of the Intelligence Committee, looking at Russian interference in our elections and our democracy. That's led me down the winding path about social media, its use and misuse. And one of the things that we are seeing on social media is a huge rise in anti-Semitism. And the community can always count on me to speak out against that, to be part of all congressional efforts, all of the various resolutions and letters and comments we try to make standing up against anti-Semitism, the type of activity, unfortunately, we saw in Charlottesville just a couple of years ago. But it really does beg, I think, a broader question of, I am very, very concerned about the rise of the social media companies. Can we even have a democracy with the level of abuse and misuse that comes over the internet? I'd make a suggestion to everyone. There's a very powerful film that just came out in the last 10 days called The Social Dilemma. And it not only shows the power of the social media companies, but it takes kind of in a dramatization an individual through a radicalization process that I think is taking place many times on the internet. We see it with this rise of this group QAnon, which is frightening beyond belief, beyond what I can actually fully share, but extraordinarily frightening. But I think it's also manifested itself in a lot of the anti-Semitic tropes that are being put forward on the internet. And I think we need to think about important ways and critical ways on how we grapple with that. We may actually need to, I believe, look at what's called Section 230 of the law that would address the question of whether these internet platforms, the Facebooks and Googles, can continue to have no responsibility at all for all of the items that they post. Maybe that was good in the 1990s, but when 65% of Americans get some or all their news off of Facebook and Google, and these platforms are used to preach hate, I do think we need to take a step back and a deep breath and a re-examination. So Herm, I've kind of hit a variety of subjects very quickly. I know how informed the community always is, so I'd love to go ahead and turn it back over to you and any questions and comments, suggestions, criticisms, and I'll try to, for a senator guy, I'll try to make my answers brief so we can get to as many questions as possible.
Well, thanks, Senator, for that broad statement. It's very much appreciated. You know, as you talked about these new partnerships between Israel, UAE, and Bahrain, certainly it's a moment of opportunity to up our game in terms of sanctions, specifically towards Iran, and what could those be now with the new landscape? And then you also mentioned our allies and how they're still supporting the JPOA. Are they in on this, and is now an opportunity to bring them in also with UAE and Bahrain to sort of increase our ability to get sanctions for Iran?
I think that is an open question. I know that I think we'd let the Brits in. I'm not sure we'd let the French and the Germans in on the developments. I mean, the UAE issue was a not that carefully guarded secret. I think we knew some of this was coming. Bahrain was a little less. My fear is, with the exception of the Brits, where Secretary Pompeo, I think, still has pretty good relationship with the Boris Johnson government. The relations, obviously, with Macron and Merkel are a little more iffy these days. And my indication, my understanding is that that the Europeans and the Chinese and the Russians are not going to allow the snapback. I've signed on to all of the additional sanctions. I'm trying to. There are so many. I've signed on to the Arms Embargo Act, and to make sure that Israel is not abused by the International Criminal Court. But what additional sanctions? Our strongest sanctions always remain our banking system, and how far that we can go. How much, how strong will the administration be willing to literally cut off our relations with international companies that where their nation state still does some business with Iran? I think is partially an open question, but I think we need to stay very, very strong against Iran. I know we had, particularly with my friends at APAC, some very fervent discussions about JCPOA. I ended up supporting it because I felt like if we could buy ourselves, 15 years, and I know that would be worthwhile. I can say this within the bounds of classification: the intelligence relationship between the United States and Israel has never been stronger, and that allows us we both bring different tools to the table. And I think even in the public reporting, there's been I think there's been reporting that that the Iranian nuclear program had a few miscues over the last year plus.
Yes, sir. And I think there's been getting a lot of good questions in here, sir. So I think at forefront of people's minds in this particular agreement, and to your point, this great relationship that I saw in my career with Israel and the military, very strong relationships. What comes next if the F35 sale goes through? Is there consternation about that? We've always kept the military edge. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the truth is, the F35 sale kind of seemed to have got slipped in there without a lot of attention, and candidly, I don't think it has been. I don't think the Hill has weighed in a major way yet. I think there will be, friends of Israel on the Hill will, I think, do an independent analysis. This was, again, I think the announcement was made before anybody had been fully briefed. Now, in my position on Intel, I might not have been briefed, but I'm not sure our friends on Armed Services or on Foreign Relations got briefed on the front end. But I think it's absolutely critical that Israel maintain its, significant military advantage.
So we had a question about the, you mentioned Netanyahu and the fact that he pulled back from his, his drive for annexation that did help this go through. What about in the future? And from your opinion, are his partisan type of, is it damaging support for Israel, do you think, or is there a way to better manage that?
I first met Bibi in 1991, I think, on one of my first trips to Israel. He is obviously the ultimate political survivor. It's not. I know it's not my case to weigh in on domestic Israeli politics, but as I grew up, as a young person, with the images of Israel going back to the 7-Day War, and Moshe Dayan and Abba Evan and Golda Meir, and Israel as a wonderful inclusive democracy. I do think there are challenges that we have young Americans who've grown up that only image of Israel is an Israel that's been mostly ruled by the Netanyahu government. And again, I know this may be offending some folks online, but my sense is, it makes it harder sometimes to bring along younger people in terms of the kind of fulsome support for Israel that I and other people my age have. But he is the prime minister, and I do hope that the annexation efforts will be put on a longer term hold, because I think it would, if we're hoping to get other countries in region to recognize Israel, I think that would destroy those chances. So I do hope they are kept in abeyance on a going forward basis. And I've again experienced enough of Israeli politics to know they're rough and tumble. And let me also acknowledge, though, and this is something I should have acknowledged ahead of time, I think Israel, in good faith, has tried for many, many years to make peace with the Palestinians. And it's just, you can't make peace unless you've got a partner. And the lack of, there's been maybe 2 or 3 moments in the last 25 years where the Palestinians had enough leadership to make a move towards peace, and clearly there's no one there's no legitimate Palestinian counterpart at this point to reach a deal with, even if you wanted to reach a deal. The one thing that I felt in one of the trips that was reassuring to me was that, again, on the intel side, the level of cooperation between the Israeli services and the Palestinian services. I'm not sure that's not discussed very much, but it is it's a very strong relationship, and I think helps maintain the peace.
So there was a remark by someone that actually saw the piece on Netflix that you were talking about, and how frightening it was, and that there's recently a formal anti-hate committee was formed to address this rising rate of anti-Semitism. Do you have suggestions on programming that you think could make the greatest impact against this rising tide?
Well, my feeling is, and I've had a bunch of conversations with Mark Zuckerberg about this, I'm not sure, and whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it is clear evidence of what happened in Myanmar country, formerly Burma, where the Facebook pages clearly incited violence against the Rohingya. I think we're seeing some of this being used by the BJP now in India against the Muslim population there. It scares the hell out of me. And, I really think we have to go with this, what's called, at least on the American side, Section 230, which is the law that was put in place back when I was in the telecom business in the late 90s that gave, basically said the social media platform companies have absolutely no responsibility for the content, as, for example, the way Verizon might not have any responsibility for what you say over the phone. The difference is, as the movie Social Dilemma so I think accurately pointed out, these social media companies are completely manipulating what information you get. I mean, if you and I both Googled the same question, we would get different answers based upon our likes, dislikes. That is not, they are not neutral parties. So, within constraints about protecting First Amendment rights, there are things such as you can't, you can still make a comment, but you can't have it then amplified by a platform if it would be hate speech, if it would be a flat out lie. We have already put restrictions in place on the internet. We don't allow terrorists to advertise bomb making. We've gotten rid of sex trafficking. We've gotten rid of child pornography. So the idea that there's some bright line that you can't put any content restrictions just isn't the case. And I think you're seeing, this is a place where we have to roll up our sleeves in America and argue this through. The good news is I think there's a lot of bipartisan consensus. Josh Hawley, a Republican senator, young guy from Missouri, has got some, I don't fully agree with him, but he's got some really provocative ideas in this space. I've been one of the leaders on the Democratic side, thinking through this. But it's a debate that's come, because the remarkable thing is, here we are 4 years after the Russian intervention, and whether it's privacy, whether it's data portability, interoperability, questions around content, the United States government has not passed a single law to protect our democracy or to protect ourselves from the social media companies. And I think that is a mistake.
Oh, well, thank you, Senator, and thanks for that work on that particular issue. We all believe it's obviously a very important one that's affecting so much in our country today. You also mentioned your great work and your bipartisanship in support for Israel. I mean today's political environment is one of continued separation and partisanship. Do you see that in the future affecting support for Israel? And I know you're doing work in that regard to maintain support. Can you give us a little bit more insight into what you plan to do with that?
Well, I think it is important that Friends of Israel get to Washington, and that Friends of Israel come, not just at APAC conference time, but, throughout the year. And I think the community is really good at educating members of Congress. And I think there was concern for a while particularly in the House, that there were a growing group of so-called progressives that were willing to walk away from our long-term support for Israel. I think that's may not be as fervent as it was maybe a year ago. So I think that's a good news. But I do think, and this is again where I want to give you my honest sense, when it appeared, when the Netanyahu government, was looking so favorable, so against Obama and so favorable towards Trump, I don't think that's good for U.S.-Israel relationships. Ron Dermer, who was, a very talented ambassador, but, it was not even a little known secret that he was, so Republican focused partisan that I don't think it serves Israel well. I think in the Senate, the problem is not as challenging, obviously, even on like the S1 bill. I think there were 22 votes against it. I can't, that may have been a few more than that on BDS. But I think we have to we have to continue to make the case. And as you know, I mean, it's not like the American Jewish community is united on this as well. I mean, sometimes J Street and AIPAC, some of those battles are pretty ferocious as well. But I hope and pray. I mean, I guess the thing I want the most is, it's so important, I think, for American leaders to get a chance to see Israel, to see its dynamism, to see its incredible energy. Seeing is believing here, and some of these efforts I think are well worth the time and investment in terms of securing long-term support.
Yes. Okay. Thanks for that answer, sir. And I think we all know that we can all be in the same room and of the same background and have like 10 different positions on the same subject. So we're famous for that. So let's talk just a second about Saudi Arabia. I mean, it seems to be kind of hot and cold with them. We know that they've had in the past, kind of undercurrent relationships with Israel, but now, our relationship with them, U.S. to Saudi, on again, off again. What are your thoughts on the future there?
I'm still concerned. I think the brutal murder of Khashoggi was just that, a brutal murder that, the outrageousness of it taking place on a diplomatic grounds was pretty awful. And PBS, the Saudi leader, I worry. I mean, I was excited at first because I kind of bought into the story that here was a guy that was going to modernize Saudi, maybe move it a little bit away from its Wahhabist traditions and advance the country. And, and the fact that Jared Kushner and him were, seemed to be good friends. I mean, I thought that net was all good, but boy, to see the Saudi leadership and what it's done and what he's done to his cousins. I don't have a report recently whether all those uncles and cousins and stuff ever got let out of the hotel or whether they're still in prison there. But it's, and the Saudi war in Yemen has been a disaster. And, there doesn't seem to be any end in sight. So I am uneasy. I don't have a great solution set. I mean, we still have bases, we still have sell a lot of arms, but I am uneasy about the Saudi government's actions. And I obviously, in terms of vis-a-vis Israel, I think it would be be viewed as a huge coup. But I don't know how quickly that will come about. I just don't. I'm just not sure. But I'm uneasy with. I've not heard anyone yet. I'm waiting for the smart policymaker who's going to say, "Here's how we nudge Saudi into a more responsible behavior, and at the same time maintain our close ties." If anybody on the call has got a great suggestion on Saudi, I am all willing to listen. It's a pretty thorny problem.
Yes, sir. I think we all know how we kind of watched in somewhat shock and awe when Saudi sent some troops across into Bahrain when they were having some unrest with the Shiites. But I think it's obviously that they're as committed against Iran as anyone is because of that. But to your point, it doesn't lend much faith in exactly where they are and what they'll do next. So it is a conundrum.
Yeah, I just wish it seems, and again, this is pure editorial comment. This is not U.S. government or intel, view. This is just my view, but boy, they seem to buy great arms, but they seem to be pretty inept in terms of their ability to execute militarily anywhere.
Well, that's true. And maybe that's a theme for those in the audience that have been concerned with the F-35 sale too. I mean, there's no better trained military in terms of warfare than, second to U.S. is Israel, and their ability to utilize the weapons really well. So, sir, maybe we could jump back to your work against, some thoughts about Russia and the interference that we saw in 16, and now again with the politics, and what your thoughts are way ahead.
Yeah. Well, Russia, a remarkable thing is, I think I saw this yesterday. Russia has the economy about this of Texas, so it's Russia is not an economic powerhouse. It still remains a military powerhouse. It still has obviously extensive ties around the world, but Putin is a genius at trying to manipulate and abuse democracies, and he needs to do this to reinforce. He plays a weak hand pretty well, and as we've seen with the poisoning of the opposition figures, he doesn't brook dissent very much. But the remarkable thing is, and what Russia has done, what Russia did to us in 2016 was not an aberration. They did it. The Brits now realize they did it in the Brexit vote. It was quite obvious what they were doing in the French presidential elections. The countries that have been the most effective pushing back against Russia have been countries like Sweden and Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, because they really educate their public about Russian interference. And it's a lot cheaper to interfere with bots or hack into people's information than to buy submarines and airplanes. So what I'm very concerned about is that the intelligence community knows and has indicated that Russia is back, spreading disinformation about Biden, tying it to Ukraine. And my great fear at this point is that, if not that we need any more September or October surprises in this crazy year, but if there was suddenly a big new story that was the result of Russian propaganda and we hadn't warned the American public, my fear will be not only the effect it could have on the election, but my real fear is, as somebody who's a huge advocate now for our intelligence community, that the intelligence community will lose credibility with the American public. The intelligence community has to be willing to speak truth to power. And unfortunately, during this president, the intelligence community has been under attack, unlike any time in the past. Doesn't matter, Democrat or Republican. If you look just at, there have been 5 senior Trump officials, from Dan Coates, who was the director of national intelligence, his deputy; Joe McGuire was the director of national intelligence, his deputy; Michael Atkinson, the inspector general. All have been fired because they were willing, especially about Russia, to tell the truth. And what I'm afraid of a little bit at this point is that the goal of the intelligence community is always speak truth to power. And if the intelligence community is shading a little bit of its findings because people are fearful for their jobs, that's not a healthy spot to be. And clearly Russia will be back. And let me be clear too, China is back. China as well. China is more is against Trump. As the administration has said, Russia is for Trump and against Biden. But at the end of the day, we should, as Americans, no matter who we support, should be making those decisions. And we have gotten better. Our election machinery is much better in terms of protection. There's a guy named Chris Krebs who runs CISA, which is an agency set up to protect this. They've done a pretty good job. The social media companies are trying. They're always chasing and they're always reactive rather than proactive, but they are trying to take down some of the bad stuff. And our intel community, particularly in 2018, and this is again one of the areas where I give the Trump administration some credit. For a long time under both Bush and Obama, Russia and China would steal our intellectual property or interfere, and we would never punch back. We are now punching back, and what you do with a bully, and a bully is Putin, is you got to punch him back at times.
Thanks, Senator. We have time for one more question, and I think the question wants to end on one of your opening statements about Ruth Ginsburg and the way forward here, and maybe in a nonpartisan way to fill that seat. What are your thoughts on what we should see happen here?
Well, if I'll just, it's hard for me to take off a purely political hat. I think this would probably upset the left, but I think what Joe Biden ought to do is say that if he's elected, he would appoint Merrick Garland to the Ginsburg seat. Somebody who was clearly a centrist, that was not, that would have been, I think, would have been easily approved if Senator McConnell had allowed him. I worry, not only because I worry about women's right to choose and the Affordable Care Act and voting rights and all of the substantive issues. I frankly think it's not a great idea that so many of our serious issues have to be punted to the Supreme Court. I think Congress needs to step up and take responsibility and make these decisions. That's the way our system should be set up. It does appear, I think the Democrats are all outraged about the hypocrisy of not allowing Garland to be voted on 4 years ago. I still think there may be a few Republicans that we can convince. And what I'd love to see is maybe, I tell everybody, I work in the only place in America where being a gang member is a good thing. I've been part of the Gang of Six and Gang of that. And, anytime there's a bipartisan group, it's called a gang. But I would love to see a gang of 12, say 6 Democrats, 6 Republicans. The Republicans agree that, we'll let the next president, whether it's Trump or Biden, fill the seat. The Democrats agree that if they, take control, they're not going to do anything in terms of mess with the rules, like adding more people to the court, and just kind of take the temperature down. That may be wishful thinking, but it's something I'm actively involved in right now. You gotta stay optimistic in this job, or it gets pretty stressful.
Well, Senator, thanks so much for those great answers and your time this morning. We so much appreciate your viewpoints and kind of the word from Washington. And if you have any closing remarks,
I just say this. I really appreciate. I think we were up to almost 150 folks for a while on this Zoom. I know we're all a little bit zoomed out. I should have said this at the front end. I hope everyone who's watching, you and your families are safe. It is, I think, frustrating to all of us that we're 6.5 months into this virus, and we didn't have to be here. I wish we would have had more of a national testing plan and national PPE plan, and but we're going to get through this. I mean, we live in the greatest country in the world. We're going to get through this, and we will, I think, be able to get this economy reopened. Although it's going to have to require, following the science. People ask me when I take the vaccine, and I'll take any vaccine that Dr. Fauci says is okay. And while we'll come out of this, I hope stronger. I also know that as long as I have the honor of representing the people of Virginia, you can be assured that one of my top priorities will be to maintain this terribly important, both strategic, cultural, mutual defense, and just plain right thing to do in terms of support for the state of Israel. So that is rock solid for me. So thanks, everybody.
Again, thank you, sir. And thanks to the community members that joined us this morning. We hope to see you again next week for a conversation with author Eitan Hirsch as he talks about his latest book, Politics is for Power: How to Move Beyond Political Hobbyism, Take Action, and Make Real Change. For details or to RSVP for this event taking place on Wednesday evening, September 30th at 7:30, please visit the jewishvirginia.org/Eitan Hirsch. Everyone have a great day, and thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.